So welcome to the third one of these, and this is organized by the Center for Teaching Excellence, as all of you would undoubtedly know. Over the next 5 days, we've got 18 sessions planned for you, and those sessions will be delivered by staff from CTE, CEL, ITMS, and the Office of Academic Integrity, as well as from faculty in pharmacy, biology, physics and astronomy, civil and environmental engineering, management sciences, and applied math. So in total, we've got 342 registrants, which is a pretty impressive number. And before I go on to the introduction of the keynote speaker, I need to tell you that if you need to exit for washrooms because of the wiring challenge in front of us, please use those two doors over there, and that will get you closest to the water closet. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker today, Adam Finkelstein, who is an instructional educational developer at McGill University, where he is part of the Teaching and Learning Services unit. There he works on university-wide initiatives to improve teaching and learning in all of its facets. His research interests are widespread, and they involve everything around teaching and learning in physical environments, such as classrooms and labs, as well as in online environments. He is currently chairing 2 working groups that are examining the selection, design, and renovation of classrooms and labs. He's given numerous keynote presentations, workshops, seminars, both nationally and internationally, and topics are quite ranging from learning design to learning technologies to learning spaces. So it's pretty clear why we invited him to be our keynote guest today. I'm really pleased that Adam can join us. The title of his presentation is Space Matters: How Next Generation Classroom Environments Can Impact Teaching and Learning. Welcome to Waterloo, Adam.
Well, wonderful, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be in Waterloo. I have to say that I was in Florida yesterday, so it is a great pleasure to be in Waterloo, maybe not so much for the weather, but I am from Montreal, so this weather is better than the weather back home, where I'm going to end up. So I tend to move around a lot, and we're going to do things more than just listen to me talk, just to give you an idea. But I strive to make camera people work for the living as I move around the room. But really here to talk about next generation learning environments and space and why space matters. So I've spent about the last 8 to 9 to 10 years working at McGill in all sorts of elements involving space. And I'll tell you about that a bit more in a second, but just to give you an idea, this is sort of the iconic view of our McGill campus, and it really does give you a little hint of the kind of things we deal with when we deal with space. You can see that the arts building there, we're from 1821 or so, before Confederation, so we deal with lots of fun things with our buildings and with our classrooms. Right now it looks more like this, but just to give you a little bit of fact about it, because even though we're 2 top Canadian institutions, we don't really know a lot about each other a lot of the time, so I just want to give you a little bit of information. A couple of things about McGill: we have about 35,000 students from about 120 different countries, and we're one of the most diverse universities in North America when it comes to our population of students. And we have about 1,700 tenure-track faculty, about 3,400 admin, and we have around 475 classrooms. No one's really sure. And you laugh, but it's very true. If you ask the enrollment groups or the registrar, they'll give you one number. You ask the facilities people, they'll give you another number. You ask departments, they'll give you, well, do you want me to include the special room I hide over here that nobody can use? So we have a large number of rooms across campus. But with a 190-year-old heritage campus, we have a really scary number, which is the last number, which is what's called a deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance basically means the stuff you should have done, but you didn't, right? It's about $900 million. So this means that there's stuff hidden behind our walls and hidden in our ventilation systems that make learning very, very difficult, and things that we don't actually acknowledge very often, like breathing, as being really important things and precursors for learning. That just gives you an idea. And our budgets are no better than yours, or no better than any Canadian institutions. We have done nothing in the last 20 years but shrink our university budgets. We have to take every dollar, stretch it twice as far, and at the same time having demanding and increasing demands from our student populations and demands on our campuses as well, and also comparing ourselves to south of the border, where tuition are at least 3 to 4 times as higher. Actually, Waterloo is about 3 times as high as ours. But even then, still a great deal compared to the prices that are being paid in the States. But I have to tell you that in Canada, we've done a really good job. And there are really a lot of interesting examples of things that we've done on our campuses and in order to promote teaching and learning and spaces specifically. So what I want to do is just give you a bit of an arc of where we're going to go over the next little while. The first is to back things up a bit and talk a little bit about learning. And I'll explain why in a minute. The second thing is really talk about why space matters and what the difference is with space. We're in a space now. What kind of space are you in when you're teaching? Things like that. And last, I want to show you a lot of different pictures and examples of spaces or next generation spaces. Specifically, I'm going to show you 5 different areas of next generation spaces that are really pushing the boundaries of what we can do with teaching and learning. And we know from working in our classrooms that is an everyday thing. And it's very often that you'll start a class and jackhammering will begin outside. We actually had one of our largest lecture halls, Leacock 132, and the city decided to inform us at the end of August that the drilling and the excavating that was being done right outside that room where they were drilling into the bedrock was not going to be done, and we're just going to have to suck it up. So we started classes with jackhammering, and not jackhammering like that, jackhammering where you can feel the building move. And we had classes go forward. And there's nothing like intermittent reinforcement. Those in psychology know that intermittent reinforcement is the worst kind of reinforcement, where everybody says, well, it probably won't happen to me. And often they're right. But of course, the one person where in the middle of their class, the jackhammering begins, they can't even be heard, they had to cancel and move on. So we know all about the jackhammering. So if it does happen, it's okay, we'll move on. The first thing I wanted to do is to start off any morning is to start off you talking to each other for a second or two. Don't worry, I won't try to force you into groups and have you work on projects or anything like that this morning. You're going to get a lot of that throughout the week, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that as well. But what I do want to do is to have you think for a minute and just take a minute on your own to reflect, what was your best learning experience and what made it great? So just take a minute on your own, think about that for a second. What was your best learning experience and what made it great? Can I just get a couple of popcorn volunteers? What was your best learning experience and what made it great? Anybody want to volunteer? Yes.
So there are several, but I'm going to focus on one is where that instructor was linking a personal story that could link to me while he was trying to explain a hard concept, what made me engaged in one of the learning experiences.
So the authentic connection with storytelling and engaging.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Another one? Somebody from over here? Amazing, you go from a small to like a big group and so nobody wants to talk at all. Yeah.
Mine's not actually in education, but doing coaching clinics, they would split you up and you'd have to take turns being an assessor or a coach or player. You rotated throughout the day, so you had to kind of take on all 3 roles throughout the day, and I found that to be really, really useful.
So again, that idea, it's more authentic. There is something involved in playing a role, being active in that role play, doing something in terms of that learning. Okay, one more from over here. Come on over here, people. You're down 2 already. Yes?
So in a class of about 20 to 30 students, the instructor had memorized everyone's name. And by it seemed like paying attention to us, it helped us really pay attention well to the instruction.
So really connecting with individual students, being able to sort of have that one-on-one kind of connection through even just learning a name of a student. Absolutely. One last one?
Small group of students facilitating themselves and not actually sitting, but engaged, being facilitated at a whiteboard, whatever.
So students active, connecting with each other, working with each other, etc. So it's interesting that you get a lot of those interesting stories and wonderful learning experiences, and very few people start that learning experience with, when I was sitting there taking notes, I had a revelation. Now that does happen, absolutely does. But it's not the most common, and it's not the most common one when it comes to the best types of learning experiences. So, the best place to start when you're talking about space is trying to think about, well, what do we know about learning? And one way to think about what we know about learning is thinking about when we learn best. So you used a couple of words already, and I'll jump past this one for a second, because I want to focus on something really important. And what's really interesting is when you start looking at teaching and learning, and you start looking about classroom teaching, individual personal experience tends to trump data. Now, that's not just classroom experience. All we have to do is look at just about anything scientific, and you'll find anybody involved in any diet is always going to look for, my friend told me about this great thing that X or Y that I should do, and that's how I lost weight, as an example. Or, I did this, and this horrible thing happened to me when I took that drug. Unfortunately, we rarely go back to the evidence to think about, well, what does the research tell us? Which is ironic, because most of us are researchers. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is when it comes to classroom teaching, or it comes to teaching at all, we rarely fall back on looking at what the research has shown and what the research tells us. People have been researching teaching and learning for 100 years, and there's a lot that research can tell us, but we often ignore it. And that's one of the sad things that we have to think about when we talk about our professions in terms of what we're doing with our students, is we need to go back and think about the evidence. So the fun way I want to talk about thinking about the evidence, especially in today's post-factual world, is to talk about the alternative facts, or another positive way, because I don't even want to say that because it just gets you irate thinking about it, is talk about myths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you, Mythbusters, the learning edition. So this is sort of the learning edition of Mythbusters. And it's really focusing around 7 big myths that we keep perpetuating in teaching and learning, and all across education, from K to 12 all the way up through university. So let's look at a couple of these. The first one is that we only use 10% of our brain. Now, have everybody heard this one? Yeah, of course. You've heard this one. I've used 10% of our brain. They made this movie, the great movie with Bradley Cooper, about what happens when you unlock the other 90% of our brain. Well, this myth, they think this myth started somewhere around with some offhand quote by Einstein, where he said something about, we just don't use enough of our brain, probably about 10%. And suddenly it worked its way into canon that we just don't use a lot of our brain. We have to figure out how to activate those other areas that are unused. And when you look at neuroscience and you look at the data behind this isn't true at all. We actually use almost all of our brain all the time. It's all over the place, the connections are everywhere, and everything's interconnected. So this idea that we only use 10% of our brain, complete myth, no reason to think about that in terms of teaching and learning. Second thing, the X person versus the Y person. These are a wonderful set of myths. I am a left-brain person, so I can be creative. I am a right-brain person, so I am like this. Oh, I'm introverted, so you have to do things differently because I'm introverted and I'm an introverted person. No, I'm an extroverted person. So this is another fun one to look at, because everybody sort of has this personal connection to it. But wait, I'm an introvert, and I have to act this way. When you look at this, first of all, let's look at left brain, right brain. When you actually look at the research in terms of left brain, right brain, the idea of hemispherization, et cetera, where, the left brain deals with these kind of behaviors, the right brain deals with these kind of behaviors, it also doesn't hold true. The more research that they've done, the more they've looked at that everything is pretty much interconnected all over the place. There is some localization in the brain, but the brain not only can adapt, so you can blow areas of the brain away and then all sorts of other areas take up for it. That idea of the left brain, right brain dichotomy is problematic, and even more problematic is the idea that a person is left-brained or a person is right-brained. And even worse, that a left-brained person is creative and a right-brained person is analytical, putting ourselves into a little box so that we can adapt to that particular box. The introverted extroverted is another one on the other side, which there also is no evidence that somebody is just introverted or just extroverted. When you look at Carl Jung, who started talking about introverted and extroverted, he actually said, and his quote was, if anybody was really only introverted or only extroverted, they would probably need a lot of help. The reality is around introversion and extroversion is most people are ambiverts, which is sort of this middle idea. And what happens with introversion and extroversion is we change. We adapt to our particular situation. In some situations, we're more introverted. In others, we're more extroverted. But there isn't this idea that you're an introverted student and you are an extroverted student. And I have to change my teaching or change my whole class around to deal with the introverted student. There's no such thing as an introverted student. There are people who can be more introverted, and some people may tend to be more introverted more often times than not. But what we have to do is think about not focusing on putting students into boxes, that when we design our instruction, that we want to think it around and adapt. So that's another myth we want to bust up, is that this idea that there are types of people that we can box, and worse than design instruction around. Now, specifically around designing instruction, here's a really fun one. Has anybody ever heard of the we remember 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see? Remember this cone? This is actually called Edgar Dale's cone of learning. You ever see this? Yeah? Ever seen this in a workshop or anything like that? It's totally made up. Totally made up. It is completely false. The guy Edgar Dale made it up, literally, made it up in the 60s. It somehow worked its way into like almost every HR workshop on the planet. And then suddenly, people are talking about how, well, wait a minute, they only remember 10% of what we read, so we should probably do more things like say and write. Well, there are reasons to do things like say and write, but it's not because of this weird cone of learning. And the danger of this kind of information working its way into our teaching and learning decisions is that we make instructional decisions based on stuff that doesn't exist and isn't true. So here's an example. So this particular one busted up. This idea that we remember 10% of what we read, et cetera, not true at all.
It does make sense, though.
Of course it does. Yeah, this is one of the, it makes perfect sense, right? It seems logical.
Yeah, when you have hands-on and stuff, you can remember.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So it does seem logical, and that's one of the worst parts about any of these sort of myths or any of these things in education is that it seems like it should be the case, but in fact it isn't.
Are you suggesting that we shouldn't be doing what's
No, I'm not suggesting that at all. But what I'm suggesting is that this idea that you're justifying what you're doing based on a cone that somebody made up in the 60s, that's a bit of a problem. There are lots of reasons why we want our students to do things, but this is not one of them. And likewise, another reason that we want to think about is this idea of learning styles. Now, people have heard about learning styles, right? I am a visual learner. I am an auditory learner, right? No, I'm a kinesthetic learner. Absolute junk science. There is no evidence whatsoever that learning styles, or matching a learning style with a teaching method, that, oh, I'm an auditory learner, so we have to do this in our teaching to help me. Or I am a visual learner, so I have to do this to help me. So not only is there absolutely no evidence that matching your teaching method to a learning style has any success whatsoever, but also there's really no evidence that learning styles exist at all. Everybody is an every kind of learner. It just depends on the situation that you're in. There are people who are just auditory learners or just visual learners. And the worst part is learning styles has worked its way so deeply into K-12 education that you hear people talking about it all the time, about how we have to make sure we measure our students' learning styles so that we can change our instruction for them. No. Total junk. There's no evidence for this. Again, has not worked its way back into our teaching and learning. So this myth also busted, as an example. Here's another one that you're going to love, and in fact, your kids will love even better. We're born multitaskers. I can absolutely do two things at the same time. I can listen to music, and I can surf the web and study, and I can write my essay and watch TV at the same time. Absolutely. No. There is no neuroscience that backs up the concept of multitasking. It does not exist. Human beings do not multitask. Okay? We switch tasks. So you can switch tasks very quickly. So you can do two things at once, but you're not really doing two things at once. You're switching from one task to another very, very quickly. And if you've ever seen those videos of people texting and walking and then falling into fountains, happens all the time because our brain attunes to things that are in front of them. And the idea that we can attune to two or three things simultaneously isn't true. This is a huge problem with students. Huge, because all students believe that they can multitask. And they set themselves up for failure because what they do is they put themselves in a situation where they're studying and basically they're not studying. They're watching TV and listening to music and chatting with their friends and writing their essay. Guaranteed the essay is not going to be all that coherent when they do that. So this is another myth we have to break down because if we're going to talk with our students or we're going to work with our students, we have to think that we have to make sure that they know that, listen, if you're really going to focus on this particular activity, you have to sort of get rid of the stuff around the edges and focus on the activity. in order for learning to happen. So another myth busted. Another one of my favorite ones. There's a great book by Todd Rose, and Todd Rose is really the guy who started Universal Design for Learning out of Harvard. What's interesting is he was a K-12, he was a high school dropout that ended up getting his PhD over time and ended up being hired as faculty at Harvard. It's a great story. And a lot of that has to do with the way that he was learning. And what's really interesting about his book on the end of average is that human beings do not line up. And that average is a really, really difficult and scary concept to work with through. So for example, in this room, the average shoe size is probably about an 8.5. So what I'm going to do is give you all 8.5 shoes. Anybody see a little problem with that? How many people do you actually think are going to fit into those 8.5 shoes? Virtually none. Virtually none. There isn't, as human beings, we don't have an average profile. We have a jagged profile. We don't have average shoulder to hip ratios. We do not have an average height. We don't have average shoe sizes. We have variable shoe sizes, variable heights, variable sizes. And this becomes a serious problem when you start thinking about how we design our teaching and learning. And Todd Rose gives a really good example of this with fighter jets. So back when the US military was building fighter jets, they built cockpits, and the cockpits were built to the average sized fighter pilot. Now, what do you think the average sized fighter pilot is? Somebody who might be 6'2", 6'1", something like that, a certain size, width, certain weight, etc. Well, guess what? What they found out as they were deploying these cockpits is that nobody fit them. No one. Everybody was flying them. They're completely uncomfortable. They had no way to be able to work through it. So they basically went back to the company and say, we want you to adjust. We want a cockpit that's adjustable. We want to be able to change and modify it so they said instead of designing for the average person, you're designing for variability. So we designed for variability, get an adjustable cockpit. So the company said, it's impossible. There's no way we could do that. It's too expensive. And they said, fine, we won't buy any more of your cockpits. And they said, well, okay, I guess it is really fine for us to do, and we totally can deliver. So they did. And in fact, a lot of the adjustments that happened from cars or are in cars came from those adjustments that they did in the military in terms of cockpits. But what's really interesting about that is, what do you think happened when they started designing for variability instead of designing for the average? Who do you think suddenly were able to become fighter pilots? Women. Different sizes of not just women, but men. So you could be 5'2", and you could be 6'4", and still fit in a cockpit and still fly the plane well. So by changing the environment, designing for variability, they got much better success rates from lots of different types of people and more diverse populations and more diverse pilots. So this idea that there is an average student that we're designing for, we really have to kind of work out of our brain. There is no average student. All of our students are all over the place. There's a huge spectrum of variability that we have to think about. And we design for the average and God forbid, force the average for a grade, which is another interesting discussion I'm happy to have over lunch, about predetermining our averages or predetermining our grades. We really have to think this part through very, very carefully. So I'd urge you to take the book, but there's no question we busted up the idea that there's an average student. So the last one I want to mention is a really interesting one. And Angela Duckworth, if you've ever heard, talk about, it's not about talent, it's about grit. And have you ever heard about this idea of grit? It's been in the popular press a lot, this idea that, it's that American dream concept. Like if you just work hard, you'll be able to be successful. And what we have to do is get students away from thinking that, I can't do well in math because I'm just not good at it, because I just don't have a math head, to thinking about I can do well in math because I just have to apply myself harder and I have to work through it and I have to use grit, which is the idea of not giving up and resilience and things like that. This all sounds great. It really does sound good. And there's a lot of merit to the idea that it isn't just about talent, it's about grit. But there's one really big problem and one thing that this does not address. Does anybody have an idea what it is?
The different interests of people?
Interests, close with interests. Anything else?
Motivation.
No motivation? Yeah?
Just the good luck of what you are born into, the circumstances.
Opportunity, or another word, privilege. Now, this starts to get really interesting when you start looking at the real data. And here's some data from the US. Now, this is from the US, so just take this for a grain of salt for the moment. When you look at black unemployment compared to white unemployment, and you start looking at educational attainment, white students that have no high school diploma have about the same unemployment rate that black students do with college experience. It's not just about grit. It's not just about working harder. It's about certain people have opportunities that others don't. You can look at this a different way by looking at median family income. And again, black students or black individuals with an associate's degree have about the same median income as white students that have graduated high school. So it is about opportunity. And we could say, oh, well, wait a minute, this is just the US. It's not Canada. We don't have to worry about that so much. Except when you start looking at our racial wage gaps. When you start looking at the wage gap in terms of race, so this is looking at, from StatsCan, looking at visible minority students that are born in Canada. Okay, so they're born in Canada, gone through the Canadian educational system, and white students have been born in Canada. And this is the wage gap that exists. The Canadian average is around 13%, but it ranges from 7 to about 20. And Ontario, Quebec are the worst. Can you imagine, like, we are close to 15 to 20% gap in wages between students that have gone through the same systems. So it's not just about grit, it's not just about how hard they work, it's about opportunity and privilege. And we can not only look at race, but we can also look at gender. Canada, in terms of the gender wage gap, we are the 7th worst in the world when you start looking at OECD statistics. Our wage gap in the genders is close to 20% as well, between men and women. So it's a little sobering, but I think we have to think about the last number, which is when you start looking at, anybody know this other magical 20% is also deals with? It's actually one of the biggest focuses that we have in higher ed in the last couple of years. It has to do with our Indigenous students. 20% difference in graduation. So we have 20% less Indigenous students graduating from university than we do non-Indigenous students. Yeah. So it's not about talent, it's about grit. Another myth that we can bust out, and we think that it's not just about how hard students work, it's about the opportunities that they have, what they come to the table, what they bring to the table, their home life, their socioeconomic status, their background, all sort of adversity that they've dealt with, including things like mental health, which we all know is a huge problem that we have across our Canadian institutions. So if we think about all those 7 sort of interesting ideas about myths that we have to break apart when we think about teaching and learning, have you ever run into any of these tangibly? And so what I thought we'd do is just take 2 minutes, turn to your neighbor again, and think of a time where it's actually impacted your decision making, or it's impacted, let's say, a department meeting, or you've talked about it at one point or another. Did any of these myths actually come up, and actually debunking them at that time would have been helpful? So just take a second and then talk to your neighbor again. I'll just take one from this side, one from this side. Somebody want to give an example of where you ran into this in real life? Any of these myths? Yes?
So the thing that you said that I find really compelling is this idea of the myth of the average, right?
Yeah.
So that's something that I run into as a faculty member all the time. We're always talking about, like, on average, what's the best thing to do, or for the average student, what's the best thing to do. So I'd say that's the one that I think I've run into the most.
And it's really the core of universal design, which is like design for variability, expect variability, think that there are going to be lots of different diversity people in your room, et cetera. So absolutely, average is a hard one to unpack because we've been conditioned for years to think about the normal curve and being right smack in the middle of it, right? Absolutely. Any one from this side? Any of the myths strike a chord with you? Yeah.
Well, I taught in Japanese and Korean universities for 17 years, and I teach writing. And so when I came back to Canada and we were doing pre-writing and word maps and clustering, I always pointed out, Japan's a very visually oriented culture, and so, and it's true, the students really enjoyed clustering, but now I think maybe if there are Korean and Japanese students in that class, maybe they're offended by my making that sweeping generalization because maybe they're not visual learners themselves.
There are cultural differences in learning and how people are in learning environments, learning situations. That really comes back to, is the individual human being like that? It's a really good question. So I think that we have to expect that there are going to be lots of different types of students in our classes, and how do we adapt to that and try to avoid those kind of generalizations? Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I don't think we'll do it.
Well, you know, this is part of the process, right? We live, learn, and reflect. Okay, so, you know, if those are things that, you know, what we don't know about learning, well, what do we know about learning? And, you know, if you have to boil learning down, all the research down into a couple of bullets, what are they? Well, what's really interesting is that when you start looking at the research on teaching and learning, I mean, basically the idea that learners create knowledge actively and uniquely inside your own brain. So people are creating knowledge inside their own heads. And we know that students learn best when they connect new knowledge to existing knowledge. So the idea that you're scaffolding things up, all right? We're always building a staircase. We're building on stuff from the past. Why we want to integrate with the course before us. Why we want to be able to integrate with the class before this class and the next class, and how we sort of show students that path. So the idea of connecting new knowledge to existing knowledge. The second thing is we know that you have to focus. This goes back to the multitasking issue. Focus on the learning experience. It's okay to say laptops down. We're going to do a different kind of activity now. It's okay to say that. It's okay to say, all right, we're going to focus on this for a little while. Don't do anything else. Because people need to be able to focus their attention in order to learn anything, especially with a new learning experience. We know that motivation is a precursor to learning. If you're not motivated, you're not going to do anything. So we really do have to think about how to motivate students. And we can talk about extrinsic and intrinsic motivation, and are grades really motivators? Are they not motivators? Are they good long-term motivators, short-term motivators? Either way, we need motivation in order to make sure that learning happens. The fourth is receiving appropriate feedback. The closer the feedback is to the event, the more likely for learning to get solidified. So the idea of the 100% final exam, first of all, the idea of a 100% final exam is crazy to begin with. But one of the things with a final exam that's difficult is there's very little opportunity to learn from it. I mean, you had your final exam, you know, right? And it's the idea, and one of the issues where when you only have the midterm and the final, why are students crying in your office after the midterm? They're crying in your office after the midterm because they've never really received feedback up until that moment. So what we need to do is think about how can we get more feedback to them more often. It's why a lot of the teaching and learning centers like ours are, you know, you talk about weekly quizzes, doing things online, getting students to practice before they come, getting that feedback loop quick and early so that people know what they have to focus on and what they have to learn more about. And the last, of course, we've already tapped on, which is the idea of engaging collaborative and authentic experiences. The closer the experiences to real life, the better. We know that this room is possibly the most artificial space to learn that we will ever be in, ever. We will never again, after you leave university, learn in a place like this. We will all be learning some other way, often on our own or often with some colleagues, but we will never sit in a room like this and have a class again, or very rarely. So we have to think about how to connect what's going on inside this artificial bubble to the real world that's out there and connect it and make it authentic. And one of the most important ways to do that is to make things active. And this was mentioned a couple of times about getting students to do things, right? So active learning is really a question that we have to think about. It's like, how do we get students to be more active? How can we get people to do things rather than just listening? So what is active learning? Well, a great definition of active learning comes from Berkeley. And basically, Berkeley talks about that active learning is that the mind is actively engaged. Active learning does not necessarily mean you're doing jumping jacks in the classroom or you're standing up and running around. It means your brain is actively engaged. Now that means you can be actively engaged in content. You could actively be engaged in listening. Active listening is an example. You can actively be engaged in note-taking, but you're active, all right? You're not just sitting there, right? And the second part is that students are dynamic participants in the learning, that they bear a responsibility in this process. They have to engage, and you can only do so much, and they have to be able to meet you halfway. And the third part here, which is really important, that they reflect and monitor on the process and the results. They have to be able to reflect on the learning that's happening and monitor where they are in terms of that learning in order to make sure that they're able to improve their outcomes. So, where's the evidence? Okay, so active learning, sounds great, wonderful, awesome. Like, what evidence do we have? I mean, we just talked about how important evidence was at busting myths and ensuring that we go back to the data. Well, let's look at a couple of key areas. One of the nice things about physics, are there anybody teaching physics here? So physics has something called the force concept inventory, and it's possibly the coolest thing that has ever been invented in educational research. And why is it so interesting? Those that don't know what the force concept inventory is basically the force concept inventory tests your knowledge of physics without really talking about physics. It's kind of like a sneaky way of testing how much you know about physics concept. Like if I drop a ball, what happens? I may not say it's gravity, or I may not, but I can describe what might happen, or if I'm swinging a rope and I let go, what will happen. So really, this idea of a force concept inventory is really interesting when it comes to educational research, because you can test a group of students a knowledge of physics, you can teach them physics, and you can test them afterwards. You can see, well, did they understand the concepts? Now, there are very few other domains that have this. And those of you that are in physics, I see, are smiling. You guys are really lucky because you can do all sorts of great things with this. But what's really interesting is Richard Hackett from Indiana in the 90s did 6,000 students and looked at two sort of conditions, looked at the sort of the traditional lecture format for teaching physics and a much more interactive format for teaching physics. And students in courses with the interactive engagement had at least 2 standard deviations higher on their outcomes when they were done. 6,000 students across there. You could look at it more deeply here. This is looking at the cluster in red, which is basically significant active learning components. The percentage gains were much higher across the board, all the way through high school and college that they were looking at, those 6,000 students. So let's keep going. Okay, so that's physics. You start looking at other areas like engineering. Michael Prince. Those of you that are in engineering, you must know Michael Prince. He's very well known. He has a great article that talks about does active learning work, and he looks at the entire spectrum across the board. Problem-based learning, et cetera, all these different types of active learning, and looks at, well, what evidence is there out there of success? And what's interesting is he looks at that there's support for all forms of it. Just about any type of active learning has some better outcomes. And there's credible evidence that faculty considering non-traditional model for promoting academic achievement and positive student attitudes. In other words, active learning not only helps the teaching and learning that's going on, but helps the students' attitudes towards teaching and learning and their discipline. Another example is Joel Michael. He's in physiology. And what's really interesting that he looks about the research across the board, he says something very interesting. He says, if this area of research around active learning was actually in medicine, we would have stopped researching it about 15 years ago. Because we found out that it works and we know it works, so why do we have to keep researching it? And that's a really interesting thing that he brought to the table in looking at all these areas, that the evidence is there, it's been there, and we just haven't really paid attention. And probably the biggest example, and this is Scott Freeman, that looks at active learning in STEM across 200 or 300 different studies. They did huge meta-analysis of all these examples and found a huge, huge increase in success for students. What's really interesting is that there is a huge percentage change in the failure rates when you look at students that are in more traditional lecture formats only versus active learning formats. And students in traditional lecture courses are 1.5 times more likely to fail than others, keeping other things and looking at other variables. And students in active learning classes outperform those that are in those traditional classes on the same sort of exams. Now you can nitpick through, okay, what was the methodology and what are the different areas, but basically the idea is the same across all of these different articles, is that we know active learning works. But there's even more evidence, and we can keep going. There's improved student understanding, student retention, general population and underrepresented minorities, improved attitudes and problem-solving skills, improved perception and attitudes towards information literacy. We have things about enthusiasm for learning, content knowledge, development, critical thinking, problem-solving. I mean, it keeps going and going and going. There is buckets and buckets of information out there in terms of that active learning can work and can work well. I mean, if you want to boil the whole thing down to one sentence, this is my favorite one. My favorite one is really, the one who does work does the learning. If all students do is sit there in your class and really don't do anything, and you've done this wonderful preparation and had this fantastic session that you're going to have planned, and they just sit there and passively absorb your radiance, you did all the work, you did all the learning. We have to think about, how do we get students to do the work? How do we get them to do the learning? And my favorite one from Michael is that, it doesn't just happen. And this is one of the most difficult parts about active learning, is that it's not magic. You just sort of don't the next day turn on active learning and suddenly everything is fabulous. All you can do is create an environment where learning is more likely to happen. Students bear responsibility in this as well. You could implement some active learning techniques and have them not go well. And that may not necessarily mean that the techniques aren't great. It just may mean that, well, the students decided they didn't want to engage that day, as an example. So it's not all up to you. But a lot of it is, because you're the one that are sort of directing the process. Now, the other thing you might think about is say, well, wait a minute. The lecture is really the traditional form of learning. I mean, this is back to the 14th century where the person would give the oratorio. And this is our tradition. This is really the tradition at university. This is the tradition of teaching. But what's interesting is if you start looking at the history, and those that are real history buffs will get a kick out of this, active learning is actually much, much, much older than lecturing. Lecturing is the fad that showed up in the 14th century. Active learning has been there since the beginning. Cognitive apprenticeships are the way everybody learned. You went to go work with a blacksmith and you learned how to be a blacksmith. There was no written down papyrus schools that you learned from, very, very few. The real idea is that the lecture showed up because there was no printing press, and how are you going to get that wonderful book and the only guy who could read to make sure everybody else was able to read the book? You read it to them, right? This was the 14th century. And what's interesting here is you start looking around, you know, this guy is kind of drifted off and looking over in the corner. These two are talking. Here's another talking, kind of like not feeling great. This guy forgot his materials, didn't even bring them. And this guy just fell asleep. They had the same problems in the 14th century with lectures that we do today. In fact, this is exactly the same. We'll just replace these with smartphones and then we're totally fine, right? So we really have to think about the place of the lecture. There's nothing wrong with the method itself, but what's the problem with the lecture is that we use it for everything. We lecture all the time. What we need to do are simple things. If you're in a giant lecture hall with 300 students, one great thing that you can do, very, very simple, if you ask a question, instead of asking a question and getting the 3 or 4 keeners in front to answer, ask the question, have people turn to their neighbor and talk. 2 minutes. Suddenly everybody's talking instead of the first few that you've asked. One simple change, no change in the design of your class, you just tweak the strategy. Very, very easy to do. And there are great examples of people in large classes that are very interactive and do a lot of interesting things. Our 500-seat lecture hall with our first-year physics course, Ken Reagan, for those of you that know him, phenomenal. I mean, the amount of interactivity that happens in this class between clickers, think, pair, share, activities that they do. He's throwing basketballs in the room. He's doing pendulum experiments. All that sort of stuff can even engage a 500-seat class actively. Now, it's hard. And not everybody can do it, but it is possible and it is something that can be done. So we don't want to throw away the lecture. We want to make sure the lecture has its place and stays in its place. So that leads us to the next question, which is really this idea of space. And does space matter? You know, I mean, we have all these wonderful classroom environments that we teach in across our universities. And we have to think about, well, you know, how do we want to design them? What would we do in our classrooms to design them better? And there's a couple of different ways we can think about space, and I just want to give you a few areas in terminology, and then think about how space intersects with learning. The first is the concept of the built environment. Architects call anything, actually now, that where we live is the built environment. We've built our environments. Our environments don't grow anymore. We build them. Even parks we build. Everything is constructed. Our cities are constructed in certain ways. They have certain pathways. There's urban planning involved. Our campuses are built in certain ways. And that's the biggest picture that we have to think about is how is our campus built? How do students move across our campus? How do people interact with our campus? What does our campus say about our institution? The others that we have to think about are our informal learning spaces, are places where our students go when they're not in our classrooms, when they go to study, they go to work, etc. That's kind of the top part. And our formal learning spaces, where we do some kind of organized teaching and learning. So I'm going to focus mostly on the kind of the formal learning spaces, because that's really where most of us spend a lot of our time. A lot of the time with informal spaces, students are doing on their own. They're doing outside of classes. And we could do a lot in the design of informal spaces and how we have students interact. But I'm mostly going to talk a little bit about formal spaces. And I want to talk about space in 3 different ways. The first is that space impacts perception. So we know that the space around you can trick your brain. And not only can it trick your brain, it can manipulate your brain. You can perceive lots of different things, including a floor that doesn't exist, or no floor, as an example. A river that you're about to flow down, which was just painted on the sidewalk. So your brain is creating that 3D space even though it doesn't exist, as an example. Edges of buildings that don't exist to create a specific feel. Architects have been doing this for centuries. This idea of manipulating our experience by building the environment around us to elicit emotions, to elicit experiences, elicit ideas. And we can use this when we think about our own design of our classrooms. How many people see a moving image? Yeah, it's not moving, but your brain is making it look like it's moving, and this will get you sick, so I'm going to move it past that. But here's another example, like straight lines or not? Are they straight lines, or are they parallel lines, or are they not parallel lines? Parallel. Okay, so you've seen the trick before, but they don't look parallel, but they are parallel. They're all parallel. It's just that our brain is turning it into something that it isn't. And of course, now, which orange circle is bigger? Which one? The right one, the left, which one? The right one?
I think they're the same.
Yeah, they're the same. All right, I gave myself away. But again, that idea that the space and how we manipulate our brain can really impact that perceptions that we have. And of course, if you've been on the internet ever, then you probably have seen the, what color is this dress, right? This actually, I think, sparked more debate and loss of friends than I think any other meme that has spread through the internet. Because the question is, well, what color is this dress? Blue and black, or is it white and gold? And what's interesting is they've done studies on this, and women see different colors in what the dress is than men, depending on what kind of picture you're looking at. What's really interesting is that middle picture is what was sent around. The two right pictures are by changing and modifying the color balance. So that middle picture, so when you look at that middle picture, do you see the blue and black, or do you see the gold and white? Now, there's only one color of this dress. It is not blue and black, and it is not gold and white. It actually is blue and black. But it really tricks your brain into thinking something. And again, it goes back to that idea of the impact of color. And what's really interesting about the impact of color and the impact of light is there's been a lot of studies about how that impacts our brain. So for example, everybody knows about blue light. If anybody have kids, I've got 3 kids, so a lot of things are framed around kids. So you know about blue light, right? And the idea that, well, wait a minute, we can't have our children touching any iPads past 6 p.m. because they'll be up all night, right? The blue light. And it's true. Blue light is basically part of the UV spectrum that activates your brain. But what's really interesting is that you can use this in reverse. So not only to not fall asleep, but actually to stay awake. And what's interesting is that they use blue lights in classrooms in a number of different studies. This is one of them. Blue lighting to actually improve cognitive performance. So what they would do is at times of the day where people were kind of sagging, they would crank up the blue light in the afternoon. And people were able to concentrate better. It's a really interesting example, again, of our environment shaping our perception and shaping our experience. The second thing I want to talk about is space impacting interaction. And this is a whole area of study called proxemics, which is really interesting if you're interested in this sort of thing. But I wanted to tell you a couple of interesting things when you start looking at this diagram. The idea of public space. So public space is basically 12 feet and beyond. So the people in that corner of the room are really in a public space when it connects with me. I can't really see your eyes. I have an idea that you're probably looking in my direction. You could be reading your email, I'm not really sure. I can sort of make out that there are smiles, but not really. But it's very hard for me to connect with people at that kind of distance because it's a public space. It's meant to be a more transmission. I can talk to a group between 12 foot and 25 foot away. The 4 foot to the 12 foot is that magic social space. Suddenly this area, I'm much more connected to people in this area. I can see where your eyes are going. I can see confusion. I could see concern. I could see changes in facial expression. I could see sweat. I could see worry. I could see you shifting your body language as we talk. That kind of social space which allows you to have that kind of interaction with your students. Then we have personal space where it's like it gets really, you start getting really close and you start having that one-on-one kind of conversation where you can really connect with a person or an individual as you move around your classroom. And then we have intimate space, and we hope that nobody is having intimate space in their classrooms. And if you are, you probably need to see the equity officer right away. But what's really interesting is that we have to think about taking our classrooms from public spaces to social spaces and be able to have them be personal. Most of our classrooms are operating at the 12 foot to 25 foot range. Most of us are behind a podium, like our backs up against the wall. We have a Volkswagen in front of us, and we talk. It's very, very hard to connect. The minute that you start walking out, the minute that you start connecting with people and moving around the room, you're much more closely connected. Why? Because you moved from public to social. And you're now able to connect with your students in a much more intimate way. And this is something what we got to try and do when we think about designing our classrooms. So this area of proxemics and interaction in space we can use to our advantage. So we can say, well, where do we want the podium to be? Maybe we don't want the podium in this corner. Maybe we don't want a podium at all. Maybe we just want to move. Maybe we need something here. You know, this looks like it was broken probably because somebody was sitting here. That's my guess. And why is somebody sitting here? Because you're closer. You've turned it into a social space. And it's also the feel of the seminar. Why does the seminar feel so intimate? Because it's designed to be that way. You're within that social space that's there. So we need to make our public spaces into more social when we're designing our classrooms. The last area of space I want to talk about is space impacting behavior. So I'm just going to play this little video for a second. 66% change in behavior. Just by making it a little bit more fun, a little bit more interactive. So this is another example of that idea of space changing our behavior. We can do things in spaces, we can do things in classrooms that alter and change the behavior of our students. The great example of this is our famous quote from Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us. What's really interesting is when, after the Blitz and the House of Commons was destroyed, Winston Churchill rebuilt the House with two very, very specific changes, which are really interesting. One is he built it where there was one side and the other side, and there was this huge chasm in the middle here that you had to cross to go from one side to the other. So if you were doing a vote and you wanted to vote with the other side, you had to get up and walk across the middle and sit on the other side, and everybody saw you do it. So you really had to be committed to be able to move your position from one position to another. The other thing that Winston Churchill did that was really interesting is he made less seats than people. So he made it smaller than he wanted. He made it smaller sized, specifically. Why did he make it smaller sized? In his mind, he wanted, when it was full, and it was full of people making a decision, and a lot of people were standing, it was uncomfortable, people would decide quickly. He wanted them to not debate for hours and hours, not be too comfortable, decide and get out. He wanted people to make sure that they had this feeling of urgency within them, and they were uncomfortable. And so that's where he came up with this quote that's often coming through architects about shaping our buildings and how our buildings shape us and how we can modify and change our environments to change that behavior. And what's really interesting is you start looking at our classrooms, and this is a classroom that we used to have at McGill. It's the same seats as here. I'd just like to point that out. So these ones are padded, so you got the upgrade. We got the 60s bucket chairs. Yeah. So it's questions. Well, what message does this send our students when you come into this room? What is the room communicating to a student?
You're all the same.
Get in, get out. They're all the same. You might have drilling. What else is it communicating? There's no space to work. Yeah. What else? Work alone.
You have to be right-handed.
You have to be right-handed. That's right. We don't want any left-handed. Those left-handed people out here.
Resistance is futile.
Yeah, resistance is futile. I like that one. And even as an instructor, what is it communicating to you as an instructor?
You cannot go between the chairs.
Yeah,
You cannot go to students.
that's right. The students are relatively irrelevant. You could give the lecture whether they're there or not. What else? Anything else? Yeah.
The teachers, the authority.
That's right. There is one person who's in authority, and they're right behind this Volkswagen in front. And that's it, this big dashboard. So what's really important to think through is that, space creates expectations of behavior, suggests how to act, and communicates what's valued. When students walk into a space and they see the layout, it communicates value. It communicates a behavior. It communicates expectations. You walk into a lecture hall, you're expected to sit quietly and take notes. You walk in a room that's collaborative and that's set up in teams, you're expected to talk to each other. When you have an instructional method that alters the room or goes against what the room is suggesting, it becomes difficult. It's hard to do active learning in a lecture hall. It's hard to lecture in a collaborative space. Doesn't mean you can't do it. I mean, you can always overcome the space. There are great people who can be active in lecture halls, and there are people who can lecture in collaborative classrooms. But the space is fighting you because the space is not aligned with the type of teaching and learning you want to do. This, of course, is one of my favorite pictures. This is from our largest lecture hall, Leacock 132. You notice that the knees don't fit on the tier. His leg is sticking out beyond the edge of the tier. Our tier is too short for this kid. He could barely fit behind this. His knees are up against it. He didn't even bother using the tablet. He just has the laptop on his lap because there's nowhere for it to go. And if he has a bag, it's sure as heck not, I don't know where it is. And of course it's Montreal. This must be in the summer because there's no coat, hat, or any other type of gear that are with him. But could you imagine a student that would have to spend 3 hours a day in a room set up like that? Like what are we doing? And this is my moment where the grumpy cat does not approve. Does not approve of this kind of design, this kind of space. So what can we do? Well, I would say there's 3 things that we can do in the last sort of half hour about what I want to talk about where we can make changes. The first is we can create governance. We create governance around the design of our spaces that help us make decisions. The second is we can design based on pedagogical principles and design based on the types of teaching and learning we want to support, not the building and the fixtures and the tech. And the third is we just start building. And I'll explain those in a second. In terms of governance, I just want to tell you what we've done at McGill. So at McGill, we renovated probably about 350 classrooms. We have about 17 or 18 active learning classrooms. We've done about $25–30 million worth of classrooms and probably somewhere around $25 million worth of teaching labs and renovations in the last 10 years or so. And we've been ripping our classrooms apart as much as we can for the last 10 years around these 2 working groups. And I chair both of these 2 working groups. The first one, the Teaching and Learning Spaces working group, is for classrooms. The second one is for teaching labs or discipline-specific spaces like wet labs, chemistry labs, things like that. And basically this group was set up and flag planted by our provost back in 2005 and said, you're going to create a vision for teaching and learning space development, steward all of the funding. Any classroom funding that was going to any school, faculty, et cetera, was taken away and given to this committee. This committee has all faculties represented, all service units represented. Each one of these committees has about 40–45 people on it. And every year we go through a proposal process where people bring forward, here are the spaces we think are the worst. And as a group, we start looking at, well, what should we do at McGill in order to improve our classrooms? And we look at a whole bunch of different criteria to say, well, this room serves a lot of students, it's really important to do, et cetera. And what's really important are a couple of key things: that any classroom that was funded by these central committees is for everyone. In other words, the provost was really keen on removing the idea that there were any departmentally owned classrooms. Classrooms were used by the university. Everybody shares them, end of story. And this is what we've been working on for the last 10 years. What's particularly interesting is that about 10 years ago, the provost went to our founding director, who's since retired, to say, okay, we're going to set up this committee and you're in charge of it. And at the time, a teaching and learning unit in charge of a committee designed to decide on the facilities was pretty crazy. And now it's not so crazy, but that's 10 years ago. And so we did more and more renovations over time. And the way that we did that is with the second part, which is designing by pedagogical principles. We took what we knew about architecture, education, and psychology research, we mushed it together with the NSSE benchmarks. That if you don't know about NSSE, does everybody heard about NSSE? Okay, so NSSE tells us all the things that we're doing badly, basically, as institutions. And we all have things to work on across the board. But we used NSSE as our framework because we wanted something that spoke to senior admin, because senior admin was thinking about NSSE and how we were doing on NSSE, so we used it as a communications tool. We designed our principles for teaching and learning spaces. And from those principles, we designed features within our classrooms that relate back to those principles. So for example, academic challenge, which is one of NSSE's core areas. Our tenet and our principle is that learning spaces should be sufficiently varied for individual and collaborative work. So in other words, what we want to do is make sure that students have enough space to work and engage with content. Giving them, 60 square inches of space to work is not adequate, period. If we design a classroom, we cannot design spaces for students to work that are not big enough. And so this is a good example where we want a space big enough for a student to pull out a laptop, pull out a notebook, etc. We want 30 square inches, etc. And we set up all of these design criteria around things like that. We want learning spaces to provide features that allow students to engage with content and with others. We want to design spaces so students can cluster and work together in a team. We want to design spaces so that it's easy for students to turn around and work with a colleague, cluster into small groups, work on the walls, etc. We want faculty to be able to have reduced barriers, podiums that are movable, things that can move around to encourage those kind of sightlines and interaction. We want to make sure that students and faculty can be able to interact with each other in those social spaces as much as possible. And we want our campus environments to be able to conform to standards, future flexibility, etc. And high impact practices supporting them where possible. So we use this, it wasn't the most perfect way to talk about our principles, but the nice thing is we took all of these principles and mapped them to, okay, if we're going to think about acoustics, how can our acoustics connect back to learning with peers? We want our students to be able to hear each other as much as they hear the instructor, things like that. And we started rebuilding and changing. So let's get to the building, because the building's fun as well. So there are, 5 areas that I want to talk about in terms of the building of our classrooms. And what I mean by start building is that we just started. And we started with small changes. We started with things like 2 rows on a tier in a lecture hall. Very simple, very basic. But what's the difference between 2 rows on a tier? So what's nice about these actually turn all the way around, which is great. Most of the swing chairs don't. But the problem with the swing around is that you're still you're at chest height with the table. And all you got to do is level the tier. And so you have 2 rows on a tier and suddenly have a table. And everybody can turn around and work on a table. Easy, simple modification in a lecture hall that allows people that want to teach collaboratively to teach collaboratively easily. And you could still lecture the whole time and nobody really knows that you did anything collaborative in the space in the first place. And that was how we did some of our first renovations. We started small, made small little changes across our campus, and then started to rip things apart when it comes to active learning classrooms, collaborative teaching labs, and other spaces. So let's look at a couple of active and collaborative lecture halls. What can you do to a lecture hall to make it better? Here's an example, very, very basic. Simple tiered room. What we really did in this space was we changed the seating. Instead of actually having these tiny little swing arms, we went to like these pull-out benches. So our furniture changed, and the furniture that we changed allowed us to have bench seating in a very, very small space, because the reality was it was a giant concrete scoop. There's not much we can do with it. We just have to make the best. And so we tripled the amount of space for students to work. Small change. Very, very small, but meaningful. Here's another example from Iowa State, 363-seat classroom. What's really interesting is the front posts chairs spin around. So you can have a group of students in each row, then spin around and talk to each other, even with those small little lousy kind of seating. So even with small lousy seating, you can still do some collaboration. Here's an example of a similar kind of space at Colorado in their Student Commons building that allows you to do that kind of collaborative spin around space. Here's the first tier, this tier that's fixed, this tier that's mobile, or movable, I should say, movable in quotes. It's on a post you could spin, but so it's a step forward, not a big step, but a little step, baby step, right? Other examples, this is from Exeter, same thing. Chairs are on swivel posts that can rotate for conversations. And then here are examples of other rooms. These are 2 rows on a tier. So you can notice here that these 2 rows, this row has 2 tables on a tier, 2 tables on a tier. All of these students can spin around and work together. Similar to what you can get here as an example. Movable chairs to move around, some really nice vistas outside the back of the room, multiple projectors, etc., and whiteboards that are on the ends of the aisles. So end of each one of these aisles of whiteboards, students can stand up and collaborate on glass. Really not that much more expensive than renovating an ordinary lecture hall, doing small changes to be able to have that bigger impact. There's the back there of that room. Here's another really radical example. This is at the Learning Innovation Center in Oregon State. And I don't know if you've ever heard of this room, but this room is set up like a giant stadium. Instead of a 600-seat lecture hall where people are at the front and it goes straight up, what they did is they plopped the professor in the middle and arranged all 600 chairs in a circle in sort of this omnidirectional theater concept. And the reasoning behind that goes back to the proxemics. What they did is they made sure that any student in the 600-seat lecture hall was no more than 30 feet away from the faculty member at any given moment. So this faculty member could basically run up an aisle and be somebody in the back without too much trouble. So it allowed you to take a scale, huge room, and really bring it down to a social kind of space. So it's an interesting room. Maybe not one you design, but again, the idea is that you're doing something innovative and creative to be able to create something a bit more intimate. Now, if I was looking at this room, I'd say, well, couldn't these have been 2 rows on a tier? Could we sort of do something more interesting and have tables in a round space like this? And that's where our active learning classrooms come. Here's Hine Hall in Indiana. You'll notice these are table rows, and right behind each row is a table with chairs. So every other row has a table. And there, of course, are whiteboards all around the room, multiple screens, etc. So these group of students can spin around and actually work at a functioning table within their classroom. Again, lecture hall, but collaborative. Here's another one at Greenlaw at University of North Carolina. What they did is they created these pods. So each one of these tiers have movable furniture on them. And it almost is like 6 seminar rooms kind of connected together. So each one of these tiers, so here's a seminar room, here's a seminar room, here's a seminar room. Each one of these groups are grouped together along with the central aisle, and the instructor moves around the aisle and moves around the room, having a large group of students in kind of a lecture hall / collaborative space where they can work. Again, not for everybody. Not for every room, but an interesting design as well. University of Windsor School of Engineering, I don't know if you've seen this room with 350 students, but instead of rows, they had tables. And those tables have some whiteboards they can work on. And we looked at this space and thought this would be perfect for us, and so we rebuilt one of our rooms here. This is the top-down design of one of our lecture classrooms that actually used tables on tiers instead of rows, and these arc-shaped tables of 6. We're able to create spaces for students to collaborate around a table, work with a whiteboard, movable whiteboards, all within a room that actually has video conferencing, so you can connect to another room. There's actually a front of this room, so there is a front. There's whiteboards and screens, etc. But the students are at tables, so they're able to actually work with each other around the whiteboards at the same time as being able to switch from, let's say, a lecture mode into a collaborative mode. So again, we have lots of different examples of taking what is generally a room designed for pure delivery and turning it a room that's a little bit more hybridized, something that we can do different things in over time. Second, active learning classrooms. So active learning classrooms are basically, okay, if you want to design a collaborative space from scratch and you gutted the entire room and flattened it out, what would it look like? It looked like an active learning space. This was one of our first ones back in 2009. So it really is old now. I mean, it's a 10-year-old classroom. But again, used so heavily you wouldn't imagine how many people we have to turn people away from this space. But again, what's really interesting are these are tables of students with computers at the time that we built this, whiteboards that are connected to the tables. So each table has a corresponding colored whiteboard. So the blue table is the blue glass board, yellow table is the yellow board. So students have a place they know that they can work that's theirs. Each one of these tables, students can work at the tables together, or they can broadcast their screens all around the room. There's whiteboards everywhere, a lot of movable chairs where students can work, and it's basically a 72-seat classroom that feels like a 40-seat classroom when you have an active learning layout like that, with the instructor, of course, in the middle. Because you're in the middle and you're basically moving around and being able to interact with students. You very rarely would need to hover by the podium. You can, but it allows you really to have great circulation around the whole space. We started developing these more and more, so these are sort of computer classrooms built like banana boat tables. You notice there's cutouts, and these monitors go low. And they go low to function like laptops, so you can see over the top. So you don't have this screen in front of you that you're looking around trying to interact with students. It's low. It's one of those high-end modeling stations, which is why we built with computers as opposed to student laptops. But we have these tables where students are collaborating with each other in an arc of 3, so they can see each other's screens. That's why it's curved. And they can work on a table of 6. And there's, of course, writable walls and projectable surfaces all around the space as well. This was, again, back in 2009. We kept developing concepts around those active learning classrooms of 24. Each student gets a projector that's projecting right onto the whiteboard, as an example. Little movable podiums that you could zoom around the room. We called them baby podiums. They were a baby podium that zooms around. Other examples from other places, this is Indiana University. So each one of these tables can project up to one of 16 tiled screens. So each screen can have, you can actually have all 16 screens shown on the big screen that's up there, switched around the room. So they're able to do a lot of collaborative computer work in this kind of space. This is Brunick's Hall in Minnesota, also one of the older active learning classrooms in North America. This actually seats 126 students, so it's very big. But I've taught in it actually, and it's a very interesting space. It is big, I mean, 126 students is a lot of students. But when you're all at tables, the students are all at a table of, let's say, 9. So you don't feel like you're in a class of 126. You feel like you're in a class of 9. And that's one of the ideas around an active learning classroom kind of setup. This one, I actually did a workshop in this one at University of North Dakota, and it's the largest one in North America at 180 students. It was huge. I mean, it had pillars in it. It was possibly the worst space you could deal with. But it was really interesting to be able to have people working in teams in that large a space. Our medical school, we've redesigned our second floor of our medical building to have 3 active learning classrooms of 80 seats around here, interacting with small group rooms around the side. So we have what looks like, if you notice in some of the designs that we've worked on, the technology is kind of going away. The farther ahead in our designs you get, the less tech you see. Here's an example where all the projectors are all tucked in on this bulkhead. You can't even see them. And they project onto the whiteboards that are all wrapped around this room. Each table has a little port students can connect. There's no more computers on the tables. But again, these are 80-seat active learning classrooms that do not feel like 80. They feel much more intimate. And this is one that we're building right now in our arts building, which actually has the projection above writable walls. So these are all whiteboards, writable walls all around the room, and tables of 8. They're around this particular space. Big windows, really nice area, trying to make that kind of premier space for students to work. So the third area I wanted to talk about is the active and collaborative teaching labs. And this is where students are spending a lot of their hands-on space and hands-on time. And what's interesting about when we started building our teaching labs with our faculty is nobody would ever dream of building a teaching lab like a lecture hall. Everything is designed to be collaborative. So in fact, actually, we got faster uptake around collaborative designs in our teaching space, teaching labs, than we did in our classrooms. Mostly because why would you design, this is actually an organic chemistry dry lab and physics dry lab, why would you design it in rows? So this is designed as a Y-shaped table, and they're long Y shapes because they're doing experiments off the edges of these tables. These are all at counter height, and each table, so the orange table has, this is glass graph paper, so it's graph lines. There's writable space here, and then there's a projector hidden up above. And each team of 12, so there's 4, 4, and 4, has a space that they can collaborate with. And what's really nice is you can actually broadcast any of these screens around the room, and the colors of the lights actually will change depending on which table is presented. We, of course, have some pillars. I think those are for free. We have a couple extra if you'd like any. We're happy to sell off all of our pillars. But this was taking a terrible basement classroom and turning it into something that was really, really nice, really, really pleasant to be in, to work around with students. So it's a dry lab. This is a more wet lab, again, that X-cross design, writable walls, multiple screens, students at counter height, each working in teams. And this is where we have gas and we have vacuum and all sorts of stuff that's here as well. Again, a teaching lab, but not your average, everyday kind of, ordinary looking teaching lab in this X design. This is another teaching lab that we built that actually functions as a classroom when it's not a teaching lab, because it really is an active learning classroom. But it's built in teams of 6, and actually we made this in wood because it's actually a geology lab. So they take out rocks. These are like heavy rocks, and they bring them out in microscopes that go out here. We have a space on the other side where they can actually project the details of a rock in high definition on the screens. But it's all in wood because basically if it scratches the surface, we can resand it and varnish it again, and off we go. So the idea of trying to make it as sustainable as possible over time. This is not our new chemistry lab, but this is what our chemistry lab looked like before. And you can imagine what as a student going into a lab like this, what kind of experience you're kind of expecting. You're like, am I gonna die here? Like, is this the end for me? This could be out of a movie, which really was. But what's really interesting is we took everything we knew about active learning classrooms and what works in active learning classrooms and designed a chemistry lab around that. So here's an example of a chemistry lab where students are standing in groups of 6 or so, and there are multiple pods. These pods are centered around a smartboard that's over here and fume hoods that are on the edges. So what's really great is that students can work at their tables on their chemistry experiments, and TAs that are here can easily circulate between the groups that they're working with. The long road labs with the fume hood at the end of the row. I mean, talk about the worst possible design you could imagine for TAs especially, where, oh, let me help you. Hold on, I gotta get out around this place and go down the other end, or get around here and go down the other end. It's impossible. And this was the idea here, to increase circulation, to have students interact with each other, and even with all of the services coming from above, as an example. 180 students, and it's a 2-floor chemistry facility. The bottom and the top corners, and basically the instrumentation's in the middle, and the students are all using the high-end research instrumentation like you would in a research lab, and they're able to basically collaborate here along with any of the other areas, and they can have multiple experiments running in multiple corners of this facility. And it's really changed their curriculum, where students are really now focused much more on inquiry-based experiments. So instead of basically following recipes, it's, okay, you got to create biodiesel. So what do you need to do it? Go for it. And off they go, and they actually work in their teams here to be able to do that. The fourth thing I want to touch on are things like prototype spaces. What prototype spaces are designed to be, and what's important about prototype spaces, is that it's a space to experiment. So we have a space right across from our offices that we use for all of our workshops, as well as meetings and other things, and it's off-grid. So in other words, we use it just for our own uses with our teaching and learning unit, as well as other people that want to do workshops. And what's interesting here is that it really looks like a mess. I mean, it's a hodgepodge of lots of different types of equipment, tons of different types of technology, and we're basically using this space as our experimental space. Bring in new furniture, test it out. We've invited faculty to give a class, let's say, come for 3 weeks and teach here as an example. And we're using this as our kind of prototype space so that as faculty developers, we can work with faculty in a space that's flexible, in a space with lots of whiteboards, lots of technology, to be able to model good behavior, but also being able to try it out for ourselves and see what works and what doesn't. And the fourth thing I wanted to mention is that idea of, or the fifth thing I should say, is active learning anywhere. So here's an example of what we have being the standard classroom. And this was from 2012. But again, the idea that we wanted a base standard classroom to be simple, to be able to have flexibility, and have a couple of key things that we learned. And as we went through this process over the 10 years, what were the most important things about the classrooms? Movable furniture and writable walls. Technology, technology is important, but it's really the writable walls and movable furniture. This room can change and convert into something else. It has basic AV and writable walls. And our newer versions of this are basically just nicer, updated kind of concepts, but basically furniture that's movable, that shifts from one layout to another, writable walls around the room, technology, etc., that we have available. So the big question, the last question I want to leave you with is, are these rooms worth it? Because this is one of those questions that senior admin are going to ask if they aren't already asking, like, are these rooms worth it? And this is what's a really interesting question, because when you start looking at the data, if you look at active learning classrooms as an example, there's no question that active learning classrooms work, and they work extremely well. Here's an example, Christopher Brooks, who's a great colleague who's done a lot of work in this area. If you hold everything constant, the students in the active learning environments using active learning techniques outperform their peers. Here's another one where you can actually flip a class and actually have less face time, and they got better outcomes with the layouts. So they actually took a classroom and had less actual classes in it. But the fact that they were using a more interactive classroom, they got a lot better outcomes. We did our whole bunch of documentation on our own. We built videos. We did a whole bunch of usage data, et cetera, and a whole bunch of research through those spaces. And of course, found a lot of things that you'd expect. The teachers or the faculty members that are thinking about teaching and learning in a more interactive way and being more interactive move around more often, they interact with students more often, and the students feel that the class is more successful. And in fact, actually, when you look at all of the data that we gathered about feedback from the students in the classroom, the variability in the responses around things like it helped the classroom help improve my learning, it allowed for more interaction, was so low. We had like a negative skew curve that was basically so positive with such a little standard deviation that there was very little statistics we could run on it, which is really interesting. It didn't look like a normal curve. We had incredibly positive results from those beginning areas in 2009. So other evidences of impact, rating experience is higher. Students that are in disadvantaged groups tend to do better in these kind of environments. Instructors tend to do less lecture and more interaction. You can still lecture in an active learning classroom. It's a little bit more painful, but you can. And there's lots of evidence to support that. But one thing I want to make really, really carefully clear is this idea of connecting the potential of a space and the actual use of this space. And this is one of the biggest fall downs that happen with universities that are building spaces, is that you build a wonderful classroom and then you get the wrong people in it. So what's really important is to ensure that do we have potentially the best possible space? And the learning space rating system that we've been working on with a number of colleagues across North America for many years creates a whole series of scoring that you can go through to actually quantify the potential of a particular space to support active learning. Whole bunch of areas there, really fun and interesting to look at. But again, it's just the potential for it to be good. It doesn't talk about how it's used or its performance. And to really look at the actual usage, you have to do things like post-occupancy surveys, interviews, focus groups, direct observations, etc. But it really comes down to the idea of a car. And I want to put out this car as our ending point, really, because Michael Schumacher driving this car and me driving this car. Car is the same. It's a fantastic, incredible automobile. But guaranteed that Michael Schumacher can eke out those specific little turns and being able to navigate and use and get the performance out of this kind of car much better than I can. I don't have the kind of skill, and I haven't been trained to do so. And that's one of the important pieces to end, is that learning spaces make a difference when you have instructors that can take advantage of them. You can't just build the room and walk away. There has to be an entire program to help people adjust, help people manage. And that's what we've spent over the last 10 years working through. Because at the end of the day, their built campus environment that we see, so that built environment that we have, is a physical manifestation of the teaching and learning vision for our institution. So when you walk through campus, the campus speaks to you, and it speaks to you about what's important. And when you walk by our classrooms, and you walk and look and see their classrooms, the classrooms indicate what's important for teaching and learning. So we need to focus on high quality faculty development in high quality learning spaces. And that's where I want to leave it for you, and I'm happy to have questions. I realize we're right at our time here. I'm sorry we're a little bit there, but if you have any questions, I'm happy to field them. Yes, Mark.
How many, like on average, what percentage of fewer seats do you have?
Yes, the fewer seat issue. Well, usually, I mean, I would say on average, we probably lose about 10% of our seating. But it could go 10 to about 25%, depending on the space and the design. The thing is that it's not just the design to an active learning classroom that really changes the drop in seating. The problem with seating is that our codes now are different. So we need a lot more space per student now than 20 years ago. So any renovation to any space, no matter what kind of layout you do, you're going to drop seats. This was the hardest thing for our registrar to get over. And we basically, I mean, we joke about basically like our job was to depress our registrar. Every time we talk, we say, listen, it's going to drop. And they're like, yeah, I know it's going to drop. They're like, how much? I'm like, well, just by like 5 seats. They're like, all right. You know, like, I mean, we basically make them depressed all the time. But it is a problem with our campuses that are constrained. We have at the same sized campus increased enrollments and shrinking space. And we really have to think this through and try to figure out how do we manage that problem of shrinking space and density of students. Yeah?
So can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Because we actually have the joy of being able to increase space somewhat for different contexts.
Great.
So are there different challenges when you're creating new space versus renovating space?
Yes. Renovating space is usually much worse because you have you get the room with the pillar, you know, like things like that. Or you have a scoop in a building or the building's already built. That's why in many situations, renovations of an existing area is worse because you can't blow out the walls, you don't have free reign. But the one problem with a blank canvas is that it can, if you don't intercept the architects early enough, it drifts off in a direction very, very quickly.
It's very loud.
Yeah.
It's loud.
Yeah. So it's and one of the things that we've done with all of our designs is all stakeholders are present at the very beginning of any of the projects. So faculty, students, the registrar, our AV folks, poor AV folks who get stuck at the end, you know, like they're there at the beginning. We all sit down and look at what the space will be. And it is difficult in those big projects because often those big projects are functioning at some high level with a group of people that are not really interacting with anybody else. You really need to get in there early. And you really need to look at, and that's where the learning space rating system can actually be functioned as a tool. I hesitate to use the word weapon, but you can use it as a tool and say, well, your plans are nice, and I've just rated it, and it turns out you haven't done very well. And even then, you can actually do something like, in many cases, hand the learning space rating system to the architects and say, just follow this. It has things like your density is 2 square meters a student. Making sure that you have access to natural light in classrooms. There are windows and doors outside. Classrooms are flat. All of that is in the rating system, and that can really help with planners, with architects to focus on the right things in order to make sure that the classrooms are built in a way that's going to be helpful. But you're right, it is one of the difficult spots, and we try to work our way in and say, listen, in your new building, put the classrooms in first. Don't put the faculty offices in first. Let's put the classrooms in first and figure out where the best place for them is, because sometimes it's in the corner, sometimes it's in the middle, sometimes it's elsewhere. And when you have a new building to design, I mean, you have a carte blanche. You can do anything you want. It's a great place to be in, if you can. Yes?
Allocation of teaching space here is a little bit touchy. This
Mm-hmm.
is time, day, and room.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to your race car metaphor, how do you, what's the mechanism at Gill to match up the instructors who are desperately keen for that kind of space with that kind of space?
Right.
And the system just goes with guns and
So our active learning classrooms are excerpted out of the system. So you can actually request one and you get put into a separate pool for that specifically. After all of those allocations happen, they go back into the general pool and somebody can get plopped in there. We really try to avoid like somebody showing up in an active learning classroom that doesn't want to be there. It's a very bad idea. So we try to keep those separate. There is, we have a number of it's almost like a form that you fill out as a faculty member. It'll show like, well, what features are you looking for? What do you need? I need this, da 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 da. And you fill that out, and that goes into the whole model, and off the model goes. Obviously, we have difficulties after the fact, and there's a lot of manual switching people around, going, I can't possibly be in this room. All right, we're going to move you over here. But number is a huge problem too, because we don't have. If you magically have 120 students, there's only a few places on campus we can go. If you have 180 students, there's even less. So we have a difficulty with the numbers because we're trying to create as many different types of spaces at as many size points as we can, but there's only so much we can do. So we do as much as possible accommodate the needs of the instructors and then balance that with the size as best we can. Yeah?
Do you have training offered to instructors who want to learn
Yep.
how to use these?
Yeah, we have a whole training program that starts in May with a meeting with all the people that are in interactive learning classrooms, and then from there we'll follow up one-on-one with our faculty. We'll do a whole bunch of our faculty program. We'll do a August orientation. We'll show up in their classrooms if they want help while they're in the classroom. They can pick up the phones and dial into AV support if they need as well. We've done a whole bunch of other things over the years in different ways to help. Okay. So if you have any other questions, feel free to come talk to me. I'm happy to chat with you, and thanks again for engaging.